flower seller was arrested for theft, and a millionaire saw her ring. The same one he gave to his daughter before she disappeared 20 years ago. The streets of New York buzzed with their usual chaos, a symphony of car horns, hurried footsteps, and distant chatter. Violet tightened her grip on the flower basket she carried, careful not to let the delicate blooms be jostled by the crowd. For as long as she could remember, this had been her life, selling flowers to strangers, weaving through the city's endless stream of people. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it kept her going. Today was no different, except for the looming storm clouds gathering overhead. She glanced up, her freckled face illuminated by a brief ray of sunlight before it disappeared behind a gray veil. "Looks like rain," she muttered to herself, quickening her pace. She needed to sell the remaining flowers before the downpour began. As she turned a corner near Fifth Avenue, she found herself in front of a grand store with gleaming windows displaying expensive jewelry and designer handbags. Violet often avoided this area. It was a different world, one she didn't belong to. But today, desperate to sell her last roses, she decided to linger a little longer. She hoped to catch the attention of the well-dressed clientele bustling in and out. Her hopes were dashed when the first drops of rain began to fall, light at first but quickly growing heavier. "Just great," Violet sighed, clutching her basket as she looked for cover. A small awning over the store's entrance offered temporary refuge. She stood there awkwardly, trying not to draw attention to herself, but attention found her anyway. "Hey, you!" A booming voice broke through the sound of the rain. Violet turned to see a tall, intimidating man in a black suit approaching her. Behind him, two equally stern-looking security guards followed. "What do you think you're doing here?" "I'm just waiting for the rain to stop," Violet replied nervously, clutching her basket tightly. The man's eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the basket of flowers. "Don't play games with me," he barked. "We've had reports of someone stealing from the store. You match the description." "What?" Violet's voice rose in disbelief. "I haven't stolen anything. I'm just selling flowers." The security guards flanked her, their presence suffocating. One of them grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. "We need to check your things," he said gruffly. "Let go of me," Violet protested, her cheeks flushing with humiliation. Passers-by stopped to gawk, their curious eyes adding to her discomfort. "I didn't do anything wrong." "Then you won't mind coming inside," the suited man said coldly. Without giving her a chance to resist, the guards escorted her through the store's grand entrance. The interior was as opulent as Violet had imagined. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and shelves lined with items that probably cost more than she earned in a year. She felt small and out of place, her muddy shoes squeaking against the polished floor. In the center of the store stood a man in an impeccably tailored suit. His salt and pepper hair was combed back neatly, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to see through her. This was Scott Mitchell, the store's owner and one of the most powerful businessmen in the city. "Mr. Mitchell," the lead security guard said, gesturing toward Violet. "We found her loitering outside. She claims she's selling flowers, but we suspect—" Scott raised a hand to silence him. His eyes were fixed on Violet, or rather, on her hand. "That ring," he said abruptly, his voice calm but laced with intensity. Violet blinked, confused. "What?" "The ring on your finger," Scott repeated, stepping closer. He pointed to the small, intricately designed ring she wore on her right hand. "Where did you get that?" "This." Violet held up her hand, the golden band glinting under the chandelier's light. "I've always had it. It's the only thing I have from before." Scott's expression hardened. "Before what?" "Before I was left at an orphanage," Violet said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know where it came from. I've just always had it." For a moment, the room fell silent. Scott's eyes didn't leave the ring, his mind racing. He knew that design. It was unique, one of a kind. He had given a ring just like it to his daughter, Isabella, on her 5th birthday, a daughter who had disappeared without a trace 2 decades ago. "Let her go," Scott said finally, his voice steadier now. The security guards exchanged puzzled looks but obeyed, releasing Violet's arms. "Wait," Scott added as Violet turned to leave. "I need to know more about that ring. Will you let me help you figure it out?" Violet hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run. But something in Scott's voice, An urgency she couldn't quite place, made her pause. "I don't know why you care," she said, clutching her basket tightly. "But fine, if it gets me out of here faster." Scott nodded, his mind already forming plans. This was no coincidence. He had to uncover the truth. The rain continued to pour as Violet left the store. Clutching her basket of damp flowers, she felt a mixture of relief and frustration. The accusation had humiliated her, and the strange questions about her ring left her unsettled. She shook her head, trying to push it all aside. It wasn't the first time life had thrown her a curveball, and she doubted it would be the last. Meanwhile, Scott Mitchell stood by the window of his office on the second floor, watching Violet disappear into the crowded street. His fingers drummed against the glass as he replayed the encounter in his mind. That ring. There was no mistaking it. He had spent years searching for answers, but nothing had ever come close to this. Could it really be possible? "Mr. Mitchell," his assistant's voice broke through his thoughts. "The security team wants to know if they should—" "No," Scott interrupted, turning to face her. "I don't want her followed. Not yet." "But sir—" "Just do as I say," Scott said firmly. His assistant nodded, sensing that this was not the moment to question him further. Scott's mind raced. He needed answers, but he couldn't afford to scare the girl off. He would have to approach this delicately. Grabbing his coat, he made a quick decision. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," he said on his way out. Back on the streets, Violet found shelter under another awning, taking stock of her flowers. The rain had ruined most of them, and the few that were left wouldn't fetch much. With a sigh, she sat on the edge of the curb, letting the basket rest on her lap. Her thoughts drifted to the man in the store, Scott Mitchell. His piercing blue eyes had unsettled her, not in a threatening way, but in a way that felt personal, and his reaction to her ring. That had been the strangest part. Why did he care about something so small? Lost in thought, she didn't notice the black car pulling up beside her until the window rolled down. "Miss?" a deep voice called out. She turned to see Scott sitting in the back seat, looking at her with the same intensity as before. "You again," Violet said, standing up quickly. "I didn't steal anything. Okay, I told you." "I'm not here to accuse you of anything," Scott interrupted, his tone calm. "I just want to talk. Can I buy you a coffee?" Violet hesitated. Everything about this man screamed wealth and power, two things she had learned to distrust. "Why would someone like you want to talk to someone like me?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Scott smiled faintly. "Let's just say I'm interested in your story." Reluctantly, Violet climbed into the car. She figured she had nothing left to lose. At worst, she could walk away if things got weird. They stopped at a quiet cafe tucked away from the bustling streets. Scott ordered for both of them, his movements efficient and practiced, while Violet sat stiffly across from him, unsure of what to expect. Once their drinks arrived, Scott leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Tell me about the ring," he said. Violet sighed, fiddling with the delicate band on her finger. "I already told you. I've had it for as long as I can remember. It's the only thing that came with me when I was left at the orphanage. Do you know who left you there?" "No," Violet replied, her tone defensive. "They said I was found near some car wreck when I was a baby. No one came to claim me, so I grew up in the system." Scott's heart sank at her words. The timeline fit. The wreckage, the abandonment. It all matched the details of that terrible night when his wife, Beth, and their daughter Isabella had disappeared. He took a deep breath, deciding to tread carefully. "What if I told you that ring is part of something bigger, that it might hold answers to your past?" Violet frowned, leaning back in her chair. "You're not making any sense. It's just a ring. Why are you so obsessed with it?" Scott hesitated, debating how much to reveal. Finally, he said, "That ring is identical to one I gave my daughter on her 5th birthday. She disappeared 20 years ago. No one's seen her since." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Violet blinked, stunned. "What are you saying, that I'm your daughter?" She let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You've got the wrong person. I'm nobody." "I don't think so," Scott said gently. "I've been searching for her for 2 decades, and now, for the first time, there's a chance I might have found her." Violet shook her head, her voice rising. "That's impossible. I'm not some long-lost heiress. I sell flowers for a living. I barely make enough to eat. You've made a mistake. Scott leaned back, his expression unreadable. Maybe, but wouldn't you want to know for sure? Violet didn't answer, her thoughts swirling. Part of her wanted to walk away from this strange man and his wild claims. But another part, the part that had always wondered about the gaps in her life, whispered, what if he's right? Scott sensed her hesitation and pressed on. Let me help you. If I'm wrong, you can walk away, no strings attached. But if I'm right, you deserve to know the truth. Violet stared at him, torn. Finally, she muttered, fine, but don't get your hopes up. Scott nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. This was just the beginning. The following morning, Scott sat in his home office, surrounded by old photographs and newspaper clippings. The desk, usually pristine, was now cluttered with memories he had tried to bury. Pictures of his late wife, Beth, smiled up at him, but it was the family portrait from 20 years ago that held his attention. In it, a young Isabella sat on his lap, her tiny hand resting on his. Her other hand was extended toward the camera, proudly showing off the golden ring he had given her that day. It was the same ring now worn by Violet. Scott ran a hand through his hair, a deep sigh escaping his lips. He had spent 2 decades chasing leads, only to face dead ends and disappointments. Private investigators, police reports, even psychics. None had brought him closer to finding his daughter. But now, against all odds, a flower seller with no knowledge of her origins had reawakened the faint hope he thought he had lost forever. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of his phone. It was a text from Richard, his trusted investigator. Initial checks confirmed timeline matches, following up on hospital records and crash site. Scott replied immediately. Good. I need everything. Keep me updated. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of anticipation pressing heavily on him. The crash that had taken Beth's life and torn Isabella from him was still shrouded in mystery. The car had been found on a remote road upstate, twisted and burned beyond recognition. No bodies had been recovered, only fragments of Beth's necklace and a child's stuffed toy. At the time, it had been ruled an accident, a tragic loss caused by icy roads. But now, with Violet's story, Scott wondered if there had been more to that night. Across town, Violet wandered aimlessly through the park, her basket of flowers hanging limply at her side. Her mind replayed Scott's words over and over. You deserve to know the truth. Could it really be possible? She had never given much thought to her past. The orphanage had been her world, a place where names and origins didn't matter. Survival had been her only concern, not dreams of long-lost families or fairy tale reunions. But now, the cracks in her certainty were beginning to show. She sat on a bench, absently twisting the ring around her finger. The intricate design caught the sunlight, tiny engravings glinting like whispers of secrets she couldn't understand. Excuse me, miss. A voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see an elderly woman standing nearby, her kind eyes fixed on the flowers in Violet's basket. How much for the roses? Oh, Violet scrambled to her feet, forcing a smile. $2 each. The woman nodded, selecting a few blooms, as Violet wrapped them. The woman's gaze lingered on the ring. That's a beautiful piece, she remarked. Looks old. Family heirloom. Something like that, Violet replied quickly. Handing over the flowers, the woman smiled and walked away, leaving Violet to wonder. Was the ring truly a link to a family she never knew? Later that evening, Scott sat at his dining table, the untouched dinner before him growing cold. He couldn't shake the feeling that the accident wasn't as simple as it had seemed. Picking up his phone, he called Richard. Any updates? Yes, sir, Richard replied. The hospital records confirm a child was admitted the night of the crash. Female, approximately 5 years old. No name. The woman who brought her in disappeared before staff could question her. The child was transferred to a nearby orphanage 2 days later. Scott's grip on the phone tightened. And the woman? No id, but witnesses described her as middle-aged, dark hair. She never returned. Scott closed his eyes, the pieces clicking into place. That's her, he said quietly. That has to be her. Richard hesitated before continuing. There's more? The accident report? It's incomplete. Some of the evidence was never fully processed. I'm digging into why. Do it, Scott ordered. I need everything. Meanwhile, Violet found herself back in the tiny apartment she called home. The peeling wallpaper and second-hand furniture felt even smaller than usual, the weight of Scott's revelations pressing down on her. She pulled out a small box from under her bed, where she kept a handful of keepsakes from her childhood. Inside were faded photos of herself at the orphanage, a bracelet one of the nuns had given her, and a crumpled piece of paper with the address where she had been found. She traced the address with her finger, the memory of that day blurry at best. A nun had told her she was left there after being found on the side of the road, alone and crying. No one ever came for her. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a text from Scott. "I need to speak with you, it's important." She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen. Part of her wanted to ignore him, to bury this entire ordeal and go back to her life as it was. But another part of her, the part that had always wondered why she was left behind, wanted to know more. Finally, she typed back, "Fine, tomorrow." As she set the phone down, she caught sight of her reflection in the cracked mirror across the room. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, what if he's right? What if I'm not who I thought I was? The next morning, Violet arrived at the cafe where she had agreed to meet Scott. She was early, a rare occurrence for someone who was usually running from one task to the next. The weight of the previous day's revelations had kept her awake through most of the night, her mind racing with questions. She'd spent hours staring at the ring, wondering how something so small could carry the answers to a life she never imagined. The door jingled as Scott walked in, his confident stride and tailored suit making him stand out among the early morning crowd. He spotted Violet almost instantly and approached her table with a warm yet cautious smile. "Morning," he greeted, pulling out a chair. "Morning," Violet replied, her voice clipped. She wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever he was about to say, but she had decided to face it head on. Scott sat across from her, placing a folder on the table between them. "Thank you for meeting me. I know this is overwhelming, but I wanted to show you something." He opened the folder, revealing a collection of documents and photographs. Violet's eyes were immediately drawn to a picture of a little girl, no older than 5, wearing a bright yellow dress. The child's smile was wide and carefree, her hand extended toward the camera to display a ring identical to the one Violet now wore. "That's Isabella," Scott said softly. "My daughter. The ring was a gift for her 5th birthday." Violet swallowed hard, her eyes flicking between the photo and the ring on her finger. The resemblance was undeniable, but she wasn't ready to accept what it meant. It's just a coincidence," she muttered, more to herself than to Scott. "There are probably hundreds of rings like this." Scott shook his head. "No, this design was custom-made. There's no other like it." He slid another document toward her. "This is the accident report from the night my wife and daughter disappeared. The details match what you told me about how you were found. Near a car wreck. Alone, with no explanation. And then there's this." He handed her a page from a hospital record. A girl matching Isabella's description was admitted the same night, brought in by an unknown woman. She disappeared shortly after, leaving the child behind. Violet stared at the papers, her hands trembling slightly. The pieces were falling into place, but she wasn't sure she wanted them to. "So what are you saying?" she asked, her voice rising. "That I'm this Isabella, that you're my father?" "Yes," Scott said firmly. "I believe you are." The conviction in his voice made her chest tighten. She leaned back in her chair, shaking her head. "No, this doesn't make sense. My whole life, I've been nobody. I've been on my own. How could I be? This," she gestured to the photo of the little girl. "This isn't me." Scott's expression softened. "I know this is a lot to take in. I can't imagine what you've been through, growing up without answers. But I want to help you, Violet. I want to figure this out together." She didn't know what to say. The idea of having a family, of belonging somewhere, was both terrifying and tantalizing, but it also felt like a betrayal of the life she'd known, the struggles that had shaped her. "I don't need your help," she said finally, standing up. "I've been fine on my own." Scott didn't stop her as she walked away, but his eyes followed her until she disappeared through the door. He knew this wasn't the end. Violet might not be ready to accept the truth, but he wasn't going to give up. That evening, Scott returned to his office, where Richard was waiting with more updates. The investigator placed a small box on the desk. "I thought you might want to see this," he said. Scott opened the box to find a charred fragment of metal with faint etchings still visible. It was part of a necklace. One he recognized immediately. It had belonged to Beth, his wife. This was recovered from the crash site, Richard explained. It's one of the only pieces of evidence that survived. Scott ran his fingers over the necklace, memories of that night flooding back. He had always believed the crash was an accident, a cruel twist of fate that had torn his family apart. But now, he wasn't so sure. There's something else, Richard continued. The accident report. It's incomplete. There are gaps in the documentation, missing pages. It's almost like someone wanted to bury the details. Scott's jaw tightened. What are you saying? I'm saying it's possible the crash wasn't an accident. The room fell silent as Scott processed the implications. If someone had caused the crash, then this wasn't just about finding his daughter. It was about uncovering the truth about what happened that night. Keep digging, he said finally. I want to know everything. Violet, meanwhile, sat alone in her tiny apartment. The folder Scott had given her spread out on the table. She had taken it with her, despite her protests, unable to leave it behind. The photos and documents stared back at her, daring her to believe in a story she wasn't ready to accept. Her eyes lingered on the picture of the little girl. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, what if Scott was right? What if she wasn't Violet, the flower seller scraping by in the streets of New York? What if she was Isabella Mitchell, the long-lost daughter of a man who had never stopped searching for her? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't know what scared her more, the possibility that it was true, or the possibility that it wasn't. The following day, Violet tried to carry on with her routine, hoping that the rhythm of selling flowers would distract her from the whirlwind of thoughts occupying her mind. But it was impossible. Every time she handed over a bouquet or counted her meager earnings, her fingers brushed against the ring on her hand, a constant reminder of the life Scott Mitchell believed was hers. She found herself walking through Central Park, the weight of her confusion pressing down on her. The city seemed quieter than usual, the noise of the streets muted by her own internal turmoil. Violet sat on a bench, pulling her knees to her chest, and stared at the lake. For so long, she had accepted the gaps in her past as unchangeable. But now, they loomed over her like a puzzle she didn't know how to solve. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it at first, assuming it was another spam call. But when it buzzed again, she pulled it out with a sigh. Scott's name lit up the screen. "What do you want?" she said, answering the call with a sharper tone than she intended. "I just want to talk," Scott replied, his voice calm but insistent. "Please, let me explain everything I found." "You already did," Violet said, her frustration bubbling over. "You think I'm your daughter? You've got all these papers and photos, but none of it proves anything. It doesn't change who I am. That's why we need to take a DNA test," Scott said. "It's the only way to know for sure," Violet laughed bitterly. "And what if it proves you're wrong? What if I'm not the person you're looking for? Then I'll let you go," Scott said softly. "No more calls, no more questions. But if I'm right, don't you want to know the truth?" The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, but she wasn't ready to let her guard down. "I need time," she said finally, ending the call before he could respond. Back in his office, Scott stared at his phone. Frustration etched across his face. He had expected resistance from Violet. It was only natural, but he hadn't anticipated how deeply her doubts would cut. Every second felt like a missed opportunity, a chance slipping through his fingers, but he knew better than to push too hard. Violet had to come to the truth on her own terms. His thoughts were interrupted by Richard, who entered the office carrying a thick folder. "I've got more for you," the investigator said, setting it down on the desk. "You're not going to like this." Scott opened the folder and immediately felt a chill run down his spine. Inside were copies of financial documents, internal memos, and a series of anonymous letters sent to his late wife in the months leading up to the crash. "These were found in your wife's personal effects," Richard explained. "It looks like she was receiving threats before the accident." Scott's jaw tightened as he scanned the letters. Each one was vague but ominous, warning Beth to stay out of company matters and keep quiet about what she didn't understand. The final letter, dated just days before the crash, was the most chilling. "Accidents happen when people ask too many questions. This wasn't an accident," Scott said, his voice low and filled with anger. "Someone wanted her out of the way. "It's looking that way," Richard agreed. "I've also been digging into Clifford Mitchell's activities around that time. There's a lot of movement in the company's finances that doesn't add up." "I think he was trying to cover his tracks." Scott's hands clenched into fists. His brother had always been ambitious, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. If Clifford was behind the crash, then he had taken not only Beth's life, but also 2 decades of Scott's relationship with his daughter. "Keep digging," Scott said through gritted teeth. "I want everything you can find on Clifford. No more secrets." That evening, Violet returned to her apartment, her body exhausted, but her mind still restless. She collapsed onto the worn couch, staring up at the cracked ceiling as her thoughts swirled. Scott's words echoed in her ears. "Don't you want to know the truth?" She hated how much the question haunted her. Of course she wanted to know. She had always wanted to know. But the truth came with strings, and Violet wasn't sure she was ready to untangle them. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Scott. "I'll be at the cafe tomorrow morning. If you want to take the test, I'll be waiting." Violet tossed the phone onto the couch, staring at it like it was a ticking bomb. A part of her wanted to delete the message and pretend none of this was happening, but another part, quieter but persistent, whispered that she owed it to herself to find out. The next morning, Violet found herself standing outside the cafe, her heart pounding in her chest. She had told herself she wouldn't come, that she didn't care, but here she was, her feet betraying her resolve. Scott was already inside, sitting at the same table as before. When he saw her, a flicker of relief crossed his face. He stood as she approached, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not making any promises," she said quickly. "But if this test gets you to leave me alone, then fine. Let's do it." Scott nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you." They sat in silence as they waited for the technician to arrive. Violet fidgeted with the ring on her finger, avoiding Scott's gaze. She didn't want to admit it, but part of her was scared that he might be right, and even more scared that he might be wrong when the technician arrived. The test was quick and impersonal. A swab, a few signatures, and it was done. "You'll have the results in a few days," the technician said before leaving. Violet stood abruptly. "I have to go." Scott didn't stop her. He simply watched as she walked away, knowing that the hardest part was yet to come. The next few days were some of the longest Violet had ever experienced. Every passing hour felt like an eternity, and despite her best efforts to keep busy, she found herself constantly thinking about the DNA test. The idea that her life might not be what she had always believed gnawed at her. She tried to dismiss it, but the uncertainty lingered, like a weight she couldn't shake. Scott, meanwhile, was anything but idle. He sat in his office, sifting through files, documents, and photographs that Richard had brought him. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a clearer picture, but there were still gaps. Gaps he was determined to fill. "Any updates on the hospital records?" Scott asked Richard during one of their late-night meetings. "Yes," Richard replied, handing over a folder. "The records confirm that the girl brought in the night of the accident was around 5 years old, matching Isabella's age. She was treated for minor injuries, scratches and bruises, but no identification was ever made. And the woman who brought her in," Scott pressed. Richard shook his head. "No name, no ID. Witnesses said she seemed nervous, like she was in a hurry. She left as soon as the doctors took the girl inside and never came back." Scott leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Who was this woman? Why had she taken Isabella from the crash site, only to abandon her later? The questions felt endless, and each answer only seemed to lead to more. "There's something else," Richard added, his tone cautious. "I found a witness, someone who claims to have seen the crash that night." Scott sat up straighter. "Who?" "An old man named Walter," Richard said. "He used to live near the road where the crash happened. He says he remembers hearing the collision and seeing a car speed away afterward." Scott's brow furrowed. "A car sped away? Did he see who was inside?" "No," Richard admitted. "It was dark, and he was too far away to make out details. But he remembers the car, a black sedan. He says it didn't stop to help." Scott's chest tightened. A black sedan. The detail stuck in his mind, tugging at something buried deep in his memory. "Where is this Walter now?" "I can arrange a meeting," Richard said. But it's been 20 years, Scott. His memory might not be reliable. Scott shook his head. I don't care. If he knows anything, I want to hear it. That afternoon, Richard brought Walter to Scott's office. The old man was frail but sharp-eyed, his voice steady as he recounted the events of that fateful night. I was sitting on my porch, Walter began, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. It was quiet, like most nights around there. Then I heard it, a loud crash. I ran to the edge of the property and saw smoke coming from the trees. That's when I noticed the other car, speeding away like the devil was chasing it. Scott leaned forward, hanging on every word. Did you see where the car went? Down the main road, Walter said, toward the city. I tried to call for help. But back then, cell phones weren't what they are now. By the time anyone arrived, the scene was a mess. And you never saw the people in the car? Scott asked. No, Walter admitted. But it didn't sit right with me. Why would someone leave the scene of an accident like that? Scott nodded, his mind working overtime. The black sedan, the hasty departure. It all pointed to foul play, but proving it, after so many years, would be a monumental task. Thank you, Walter, Scott said, shaking the man's hand. You've been a great help. After Walter left, Scott turned to Richard. We need to find out who was driving that car. I don't care how long it takes or how much it costs. Richard nodded. I'll dig into the records, if there's anything to find. I'll find it. While Scott was unraveling the mystery, Violet was grappling with her own doubts. She couldn't bring herself to sell flowers that day, so she wandered aimlessly through the city, her thoughts swirling. The photos Scott had shown her haunted her, especially the one of the little girl with the ring. She had spent hours comparing it to her own reflection in the mirror, searching for some undeniable proof that they were one and the same. But all she found were more questions. Eventually, she found herself back at the orphanage where she had spent her childhood. The building was older now, its once bright paint faded and peeling. She stood outside for a long time, memories flooding back, both good and bad. Finally, she worked up the courage to go inside. The halls were quieter than she remembered. The laughter of children replaced by the hum of distant voices. She approached the front desk, where a kind-looking woman greeted her. Can I help you? The woman asked. I grew up here, Violet said hesitantly. I was wondering if you have any records. Anything about when I was brought in? The woman smiled sympathetically. We don't get many visitors like you, let me check. Violet waited as the woman disappeared into a back room. When she returned, she was holding a thin file. This is all we have, she said, handing it over. Violet opened the file with trembling hands. Inside was a single piece of paper with sparse information. Her name, the date she was brought in, and a note that read, found near Route 87, no family present. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her stomach churn. She closed the file and thanked the woman before leaving, her mind racing. Route 87. That was the same road Scott had mentioned, the same road where the crash had occurred. As she walked away from the orphanage, a single thought echoed in her mind. Maybe he's telling the truth. The cafe was busier than usual when Violet arrived the next morning. The clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversation created a comforting white noise, but her nerves were far from settled. She spotted Scott at their usual table, already waiting for her. His expression was a mix of hope and restraint, as though he was carefully managing his emotions to avoid scaring her off. Violet hesitated at the door, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. She had spent the night turning over every possible outcome in her mind. What if the test confirmed Scott's suspicions? What if it didn't? Either way, her life would never be the same. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to move forward. Morning, she said, sliding into the seat across from him. Morning, Scott replied, his tone cautious. I appreciate you coming. I figured I might as well, Violet said, her voice sharp despite her efforts to appear calm. Better to get this over with than keep wondering. Scott nodded, understanding her frustration. The results should come in today. The lab said they'd expedite the process. Violet's stomach twisted. Great, she muttered, stirring the coffee the waiter had just placed in front of her. So, what happens if it's true? If I really am your daughter? Scott leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. Then we figure it out together, whatever you need. Time, space. I'll give it to you. I just want to know the truth, Violet. She avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the swirling coffee in her cup. And if it's not true, then I'll respect that, Scott said softly. But I don't think it'll come to that. Violet didn't respond. She wasn't ready to entertain the possibility that Scott might be right, even though a small part of her, a part she barely acknowledged, wanted him to be hours later. Violet was back in her tiny apartment, pacing the worn carpet as she waited for Scott's call. The anticipation was unbearable. She'd never cared much about her past before, but now it felt like her entire world hinged on what those results would say. Her phone buzzed and she snatched it up, her heart pounding. It was Scott. "Hello?" she answered, her voice unsteady. "Violet," Scott said, his tone serious but calm. "The results are in." She held her breath, and there was a pause, as though he was giving her a moment to prepare herself. "The test confirms it," he said finally. "You're my daughter." The words hit her like a freight train. Violet sank onto the edge of her bed, her mind spinning. She had prepared herself for this possibility, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way she wasn't ready for. "Violet, are you still there?" Scott asked gently. Yeah," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," Scott said. "Take all the time you need. I'm here whenever you're ready." "Okay," Violet said, her throat tight. She ended the call and stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror across the room. The girl looking back at her didn't feel like anyone's daughter, much less the child of a powerful man like Scott Mitchell. But the evidence was undeniable. The ring, the photos, the DNA, it all pointed to a truth she couldn't escape. Scott sat in his office, staring at the test results on his desk. He should have felt relief, joy even, but all he could think about was how much time had been lost. 20 years, 2 decades of birthdays, holidays and milestones. Gone. And for what? He clenched his fists, anger rising in his chest. Whoever had taken Isabella from him had stolen more than just time. They had stolen memories, a life that could never be fully recovered. His phone buzzed, and he saw a message from Richard. "Found something. Call me ASAP." Scott didn't hesitate. "What is it?" he asked as soon as Richard picked up. "I traced the black sedan," Richard said. "There's a record of a vehicle matching its description being registered to Clifford Mitchell's company at the time of the crash." Scott's blood ran cold. "Are you sure?" "Positive. It gets worse. I've been going through financial records from that period, and there's a pattern of large, unexplained withdrawals tied to shell accounts. It looks like Clifford was siphoning money from the company for years." Scott gritted his teeth. "That bastard, he's behind this, isn't he?" "It's looking that way," Richard said. "But proving it will take more digging." "Then dig faster," Scott snapped. "I want everything on Clifford. Everything." The next day, Violet found herself standing outside Scott's office, her emotions a tangled mess. She hadn't planned on coming, but after a sleepless night, she realized she couldn't ignore this any longer. If Scott was truly her father, then she deserved to know the whole story. The receptionist ushered her into the office, where Scott stood to greet her. He looked surprised but pleased to see her. "Violet," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I wasn't expecting you." "I wasn't expecting to come," she admitted, sitting down. "But I need answers. If I'm really your daughter, then I need to know everything. Not just about me, but about what happened." Scott nodded, his expression serious. "You deserve the truth," he said, "and I'll tell you everything I know. But I need you to understand. There are still pieces of this puzzle I'm trying to put together." Violet crossed her arms. "Then let's start with what you have." Scott leaned back in his chair, his eyes heavy with the weight of 2 decades of searching. "It all started the night of the crash," he began. Scott leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished desk as he began recounting the story. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of years of pain. "It was late, just past midnight, when I got the call. The police said there had been an accident. Beth's car had veered off Route 87 by the time I arrived. The scene was already cleared. The wreckage was unrecognizable." Violet sat silently, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. She watched Scott closely, noting the way his jaw tightened and his fingers trembled slightly as he spoke. For all his wealth and power, he seemed vulnerable, like a man who had been haunted by his past for far too long. They told me Beth was gone, Scott continued, his voice breaking for the first time. But there was no sign of Isabella. Just her stuffed toy, half-burned, lying in the dirt. I thought she had been taken, but no one knew anything. The investigation went nowhere. Violet's throat tightened. The image of a burned toy lying alone in the wreckage hit too close to home. "And you really think that I'm her?" she asked hesitantly. "I don't just think," Scott said, sliding a folder across the desk toward her. "I know." Violet opened the folder, her eyes scanning the DNA results. There it was, in black and white. 99.9% probability of parentage. The paper trembled in her hands as the reality of it sank in. "It's undeniable," Scott said softly. "You're my daughter, Violet. My Isabella." The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Violet set the folder down and took a shaky breath. "But if I was found near the crash, how did I end up at the orphanage? Who left me there?" Scott shook his head. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. All I know is that someone took you from that crash and brought you to the hospital. After that, you were transferred to the orphanage. It doesn't make sense." Violet stared at the floor, her mind racing. She wanted to reject it all, to cling to the life she knew, but the pieces fit too perfectly to ignore. The ring, the photos, the DNA, they all pointed to a truth she couldn't deny. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted quietly. "I don't know how to be someone's daughter." Scott's expression softened. "We'll figure it out together, there's no rush. I just want to be here for you." Before Violet could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Richard stepped in, holding another folder. "I have more information," he said, glancing at Violet before turning to Scott. "Should I?" "It's okay," Scott said, gesturing for him to continue. "You can speak freely," Richard nodded, opening the folder. "I found more connections to Clifford. Financial records show he was making large withdrawals from the company around the time of the accident. And there's this, an anonymous letter sent to Beth a week before the crash." He handed the letter to Scott. Scott read it, his eyes narrowing. "Stay out of matters you don't understand. Accidents happen to people who ask too many questions." He slammed the paper onto the desk. "It's him, it has to be." "Who's him?" Violet asked, her voice sharp. "Clifford Mitchell," Scott said bitterly. "My brother, he's always been ambitious, but this goes beyond anything I imagined." Violet frowned. "You think your brother caused the accident?" Scott nodded. "I'm certain of it. He had everything to gain by getting rid of Beth. She was starting to question his activities at the company, and I think she found something that threatened him. So, what do we do now?" Violet asked, a mix of fear and determination in her voice. Scott looked at her, his eyes filled with resolve. "We expose him. But first, we need more evidence." That evening, Violet found herself back in her apartment, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She paced the room, trying to make sense of everything. Just days ago, she was a flower seller scraping by on the streets of New York. Now, she was Isabella Mitchell, a woman with a father, a past, and a future she hadn't asked for. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Scott. "We'll get through this together, rest well." She didn't reply. Instead, she picked up the folder of documents he had given her earlier. As she flipped through the pages, she stopped at the DNA results again. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She wanted to feel anger, or relief, or something concrete, but all she felt was numb. Finally, she set the papers aside and crawled into bed, pulling the blanket tightly around her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder what it might be like to have a family, someone who cared, someone who stayed. Meanwhile, Scott sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand. He stared at the letter Richard had found, his mind replaying every interaction he'd had with Clifford over the years. The signs had been there all along, subtle but unmistakable. Clifford's impatience, his growing resentment, the way he had always seemed to sidestep questions about company finances. Scott's grip tightened on the glass. Clifford had taken everything from him, his wife, his daughter, and 20 years of his life. But not anymore. He was going to make this right, no matter the cost. The morning light filtered through the curtains of Violet's apartment, casting a soft glow on the scattered papers and open folders that still sat on her coffee table. She stirred awake, her mind immediately returning to the events of the previous day. For a fleeting moment, she had hoped it was all a dream, a strange, implausible dream, but the ring on her finger and the weight in her chest told her otherwise. With a deep breath, Violet decided to confront the day. If she was truly Isabella Mitchell, she needed to start acting like it, even if the thought terrified her. She grabbed her coat and headed out, the chilly New York air waking her up as she walked toward the address Scott had given her the day before. Scott was already waiting when Violet arrived at the grand townhouse. The building was as intimidating as the man himself, towering, elegant, and meticulously maintained. For a moment, Violet hesitated at the steps, clutching the railing as if it could anchor her to the life she was leaving behind. Scott appeared at the door, his expression lighting up when he saw her. "You came," he said warmly, stepping aside to let her in. "I guess I couldn't avoid it forever," Violet replied, her voice laced with nervousness as she stepped into the marble-floored entryway. The house was everything she had imagined: gleaming chandeliers, plush furniture, and walls adorned with expensive artwork. She felt completely out of place. "This is your home now, if you want it to be," Scott said, as though reading her mind. "You don't have to decide anything today. I just want you to see what's here." Violet nodded, following him through the house as he pointed out rooms and hallways, each one more impressive than the last. But what caught her attention wasn't the grandeur. It was the small personal touches: a row of framed photos on a side table, a pair of worn shoes by the door, a child's drawing framed in the kitchen. It was a home, not just a mansion. Scott stopped in front of a large wooden door at the end of the hallway. "This was your room," he said, pushing it open. Violet stepped inside, her breath catching as she took in the space. The room was bright and airy, with soft pastel walls and a canopy bed in the corner. Toys and books were neatly arranged on shelves, and a small desk sat by the window, overlooking the garden. "It's exactly how you left it," Scott said quietly. "I couldn't bring myself to change anything." Violet ran her fingers along the edge of the desk, her heart aching at the sight of the abandoned room. She didn't remember it. How could she? But it felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain. "It's strange," she said finally. "I feel like I should recognize it, but I don't." "That's okay," Scott said, his voice gentle. "Memories can take time. I just wanted you to see it." Over the next few hours, Scott and Violet began the delicate process of getting to know each other. They sat in the kitchen, sipping coffee and exchanging stories. Scott shared anecdotes about Isabella's childhood, her love of animals, her tendency to collect rocks and leaves from the garden. Violet listened quietly, trying to reconcile the little girl he described with the woman she had become. "What about you?" Scott asked eventually. "What was it like for you, growing up?" Violet hesitated. Her childhood wasn't something she liked to dwell on. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "The orphanage was okay, I guess. The people there tried their best, but it's not the same as having a family." Scott's expression darkened, guilt flickering across his face. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "You should never have had to go through that." "It's not your fault," Violet said quickly. "None of this is. I should have found you sooner," Scott insisted. "I should have tried harder." Violet didn't know how to respond. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of 2 decades of regret. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to blame him. He had done everything he could. And now, he was here. Later that evening, Violet found herself wandering through the house, exploring on her own. She ended up in Scott's study, where a large family portrait hung above the fireplace. She stared at it for a long time, her eyes drawn to the little girl in the front. "Isabella, do you see it?" Scott's voice startled her. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, watching her with a faint smile. "The resemblance," Violet shrugged. "I guess it's weird, though. Looking at her. At me, I guess. I don't feel anything." "That's okay," Scott said, stepping into the room. "It'll take time." Violet turned back to the portrait, her thoughts swirling. "What happens now?" she asked. Scott paused, considering his words carefully. "Now, we focus on moving forward, together." Violet nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what that meant, for the first time in her life. She wasn't alone. It was terrifying and comforting all at once. As the night fell, Violet returned to the guest room Scott had prepared for her. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the city lights. Her life had changed so drastically in such a short time, and she didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The following morning, Violet woke up to the unfamiliar warmth of sunlight streaming through the large windows of her guest room. The bed was soft, the linens luxurious, a stark contrast to the cramped cot she had grown used to in her tiny apartment. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to enjoy the comfort, but the weight of her situation quickly pulled her back to reality. After getting dressed, she ventured downstairs, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Scott was already in the kitchen, flipping through a newspaper. He looked up when she entered, his face brightening with a warm smile. "Morning," he greeted, gesturing to a steaming cup waiting for her. "Morning," Violet replied, hesitantly taking a seat at the table. As they ate breakfast, Scott brought up the topic that had been hanging in the air since her arrival. "I know it's a lot to take in, but I want you to feel at home here. If there's anything you need, anything at all, just let me know." Violet nodded, though the idea of this house being her home still felt surreal. "Thanks," she said quietly, her eyes drifting to the large windows that overlooked the garden. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Moments later, a tall, sharply dressed man entered the kitchen. His presence was commanding, his movements deliberate. Violet immediately recognized him from the photos Scott had shown her. It was Clifford Mitchell, Scott's younger brother. "Clifford," Scott said, his tone cool but cordial. "I wasn't expecting you." "Well, I had to see it for myself," Clifford replied, his gaze shifting to Violet. His smile was polite, but his eyes held a glint of skepticism. "So, this is the prodigal daughter." Violet bristled at his tone but managed to keep her expression neutral. "I guess I am," she said, meeting his gaze. Clifford chuckled, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "You'll have to forgive me for being cautious," he said, leaning against the counter. "It's just so sudden, isn't it? After all these years, she turns up out of nowhere." Scott's jaw tightened. "She didn't turn up. I found her, and the DNA test confirmed everything." "Ah, yes, the infallible DNA test," Clifford said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Still, you have to admit it's a lot to process." Violet felt her temper rising but forced herself to stay calm. "I don't need you to believe me," she said evenly. "The truth doesn't change just because you don't like it." Clifford raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her response. "Feisty," he remarked, smirking. "I suppose that runs in the family." Scott stepped in, his tone firm. "That's enough, Clifford. She's my daughter, and she belongs here. If you can't accept that, you're welcome to leave." Clifford held up his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, Scott. I'm just making conversation." He turned to Violet, his smile widening. "Welcome to the family, Isabella. I'm sure you'll fit right in." With that, he exited the room, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Later that day, Violet found herself wandering the garden, trying to process the encounter. Clifford's words had been polite enough on the surface, but there was an undercurrent of hostility that she couldn't ignore. Scott joined her, his hands tucked into his pockets. "I'm sorry about Clifford," he said. "He can be difficult." "That's one way to put it," Violet muttered, kicking at a loose stone on the path. "What's his problem anyway?" Scott hesitated before answering. "Clifford has always been ambitious. He wanted to take over the company after our father passed, but it was left to me. I think he's always resented that." "And now he resents me?" Violet asked. Scott sighed. "He sees you as a threat. With you back in the picture, the family legacy isn't just his to control anymore." Violet frowned, the pieces starting to click into place. "Do you think he knows something about what happened to me? About the accident?" Scott's expression darkened. "It's possible. He was always good at keeping secrets." Meanwhile, Clifford retreated to his office, his polished demeanor slipping away the moment he closed the door. He poured himself a drink, his mind racing. Isabella's return threatened everything he had built over the years. He had spent 2 decades consolidating his power within the company, and now, with her back, Scott had all the ammunition he needed to push him out for good. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "We need to meet," he said curtly. "It's about Isabella." That evening, Violet decided to confront her doubts head-on. She approached Scott in his study, her expression determined. "I want to help," she said. Scott looked up from the documents spread across his desk. "Help with what?" "With Clifford," Violet replied. "If he's hiding something, I want to know. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about what happened to Mom." Scott studied her for a moment, pride and concern warring in his expression. "Are you sure? This could get dangerous." "I'm sure," Violet said firmly. "I've spent my whole life wondering who I am. If there's even a chance Clifford knows the truth, I'm not going to let him get away with it." Scott nodded, his resolve hardening. "Okay, then we do this together." As the night deepened, father and daughter pored over files and records, searching for anything that could link Clifford to the accident. It was a daunting task, but for the first time, Violet felt a sense of purpose. She wasn't just a flower seller anymore. She was Isabella Mitchell, and she was ready to fight for the truth. The morning air in the Mitchell household was unusually still, as though the tension lingering from Clifford's visit had seeped into the walls. Violet woke early, determined to focus on the investigation Scott had started. After a quick breakfast, she found herself back in the study, where Scott had spent hours combing through files the night before. Stacks of papers and old photographs covered the desk, but one item caught Violet's attention: a leather-bound journal, worn with age. She picked it up, running her fingers over the embossed initials on the cover. "BM. "What's this?" she asked, holding it up as Scott walked into the room. Scott's eyes softened when he saw the diary. "That belonged to Beth," he said. "She used to write in it every day, after the accident. I couldn't bring myself to read it. But now, with everything we've learned," he trailed off, gesturing for Violet to open it. Violet hesitated, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and guilt as she flipped through the pages. The entries started out light and cheerful, detailing family outings, Isabella's milestones, and Beth's hopes for the future. But as she read further, the tone shifted. "Clifford has been acting strange lately. He's more secretive than usual, and I can't shake the feeling that he's hiding something from Scott. I overheard Clifford on the phone today. He mentioned an opportunity that he didn't want Scott to know about. I don't trust him." Violet frowned, her grip tightening on the book. "She suspected Clifford," she said, looking up at Scott. Scott nodded grimly. Beth always had a keen sense for people if she thought Clifford was up to something. "She was probably right," Violet continued reading, the entries becoming more ominous. "I found documents in Clifford's office, financial records that don't add up. I'm not sure what he's doing, but I can't stay quiet about it. Scott needs to know. Clifford confronted me today. He knows I've been looking into his accounts. He warned me to stop, but I can't ignore this. If something happens to me, Scott needs to keep looking. He can't let Clifford get away with this." Violet's heart raced as she read the final entry, written just 2 days before the crash. "I'm scared. Clifford's threats are becoming more direct. I've decided to tell Scott everything tomorrow. He deserves to know the truth." She looked up at Scott, her voice shaking. She knew Clifford was involved in something, and she tried to stop him. Scott's face darkened, a storm of emotions flickering across his features. "And she paid the price for it," he said quietly, determined to uncover more. Scott called Richard and shared the contents of the diary. "We need to focus on Clifford's financial records," he said. "Beth found something before the crash, and I want to know exactly what it was." Richard agreed, promising to dig deeper. Meanwhile, Violet felt a growing sense of urgency. Every piece of evidence they uncovered brought her closer to understanding what had happened to her mother, and what had led to the life she had been forced to live. Later that day, Violet ventured into the garden, seeking a moment of clarity. The sprawling green space was quiet, the kind of place that invited reflection. She sat on a bench near a fountain, her mind replaying the words in Beth's diary. The idea that her uncle, someone who was supposed to be family, could have orchestrated such a devastating series of events made her stomach turn. She thought back to his smug demeanor during their first meeting, the way he had dismissed her existence with a veneer of politeness. "He knows I'm a threat now," she muttered to herself. Inside the house, Scott was going through a box of Beth's belongings when he found something that stopped him cold. A set of photographs, taken just days before the crash. In one of them, Beth was standing in the driveway, holding a folder that looked identical to the one Violet had found in Clifford's financial records. Scott's hands trembled as he examined the photo. The folder was labeled with a name he recognized all too well: Mitchell Holdings Offshore Accounts. Richard was right, he muttered. Clifford's been hiding money for years. Scott knew they were getting closer to the truth, but he also knew that Clifford wouldn't go down without a fight. That evening, over dinner, Scott shared the photos and his findings with Violet. Beth wasn't just suspicious. She had proof, he said. That folder could have exposed everything Clifford was doing. And now, we know why he wanted her silenced. Violet's jaw tightened. Do you think he still has those records? Possibly, Scott said. If we can find them, we might have enough to bring him down. Violet nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. Then we find them. Meanwhile, Clifford sat in his dimly lit office, a glass of scotch in one hand and his phone in the other. His expression was tense as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. They're digging into the past, Clifford said, his voice low. Scott's trying to piece everything together. And that girl, she's more like her mother than I expected. What do you want me to do? The voice asked. Keep an eye on them, Clifford replied. And if they get too close, take care of it. As the night deepened, Violet returned to her room, Beth's diary still in her hands. She couldn't stop thinking about the final entry, the fear and resolve in her mother's words. I won't let him get away with it, she whispered to herself. For the first time, she felt a connection to the mother she had never truly known, a connection forged through courage, determination, and an unyielding fight for the truth. The next morning, Scott and Violet sat in the study, poring over the photographs and Beth's diary. The tension between them was palpable, both determined to expose Clifford but acutely aware of the risks involved. We need to find that folder, Scott said, tapping one of the photos. If Beth had it before the crash. There's a chance Clifford kept it somewhere. Violet nodded. Do you think he's suspicious about us digging into this? Scott hesitated. If he isn't yet, he will be soon. Clifford's not the type to sit idle when he feels threatened. The conversation was interrupted by Richard's arrival, carrying a laptop and a stack of files. I've been going through Clifford's financial records, he said, setting everything on the desk. And it's worse than we thought. He opened the laptop, showing a spreadsheet filled with transactions. Clifford's been funneling money through offshore accounts for years. He's been hiding profits from Mitchell Holdings and using them to fund personal projects, most of them illegal. Scott's jaw tightened. This is exactly what Beth found. Richard nodded. It matches the descriptions in her diary. But there's more. I found a series of payments to a private investigator around the time of the crash. Clifford might have hired someone to stage the accident. Violet's stomach churned. So he planned it. He really planned to kill her. It's looking that way, Richard said grimly. But we need more proof to tie him directly to the crash. Determined to act, Scott decided it was time to confront Clifford indirectly. That afternoon, he invited his brother to the house under the pretense of discussing company matters. Violet watched from the study window as Clifford's car pulled into the driveway, her heart pounding with anticipation. Are you sure about this? She asked Scott, as he straightened his tie. I'm not letting him dictate the narrative anymore, Scott replied. It's time to turn the pressure up. The conversation began civilly enough. With Scott and Clifford seated in the living room, Violet stayed hidden just out of sight, listening to every word. Clifford, I've been reviewing some old company records, Scott began casually. It seems there were some irregularities around the time Beth passed. Do you know anything about that? Clifford's expression didn't falter, but Violet noticed the slight twitch of his jaw. Irregularities? That was decades ago, Scott. Why dig it up now? Because I have reason to believe those irregularities weren't accidents, Scott said, his tone sharpening. Beth found something, didn't she? Something you didn't want anyone else to see. Clifford leaned back, his smile cold and calculated. Careful, Scott. Accusations like that could ruin a man. Only if they're true, Scott countered. And I intend to find out. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Clifford stood, brushing imaginary lint from his jacket. You're wasting your time, Scott. Dig all you want, but you won't find anything. He turned to leave but paused in the doorway, his gaze flicking briefly toward Violet's hiding spot. Oh, "And give my regards to your daughter," he said, the word dripping with disdain. "She seems to be adjusting well." After Clifford left, Violet stepped into the room, her hands clenched into fists. "He knows," she said. "He knows we're onto him." Scott nodded. "Good. Let him sweat." But Violet wasn't convinced. "What if he retaliates? What if he tries to stop us?" "Then we'll be ready," Scott said firmly. "We've come too far to back down now." That evening, Violet couldn't shake the feeling that Clifford was planning something. She paced the halls of the house, her thoughts racing. She was no stranger to danger. Her life on the streets had taught her how to recognize a threat, and Clifford was more than a threat. He was a ticking time bomb. Her phone buzzed, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. "Stay out of this, or you'll regret it." Violet's heart skipped a beat. She rushed to find Scott, showing him the message. "He's trying to scare me," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "It won't work." Scott frowned, his protective instincts kicking in. "We need to take this seriously. I'll increase security around the house. He won't get to you." Violet shook her head. "I'm not scared of him. He's been controlling this family for too long, and I'm not letting him win." Scott placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll bring him down, together." Meanwhile, Clifford sat in his dimly lit office, his expression dark. He sipped his scotch slowly, his mind calculating his next move. The girl was a problem, one he hadn't anticipated, but problems could be dealt with. He picked up his phone and made a call. "It's time to clean up this mess," he said curtly. "Make sure they don't find anything." As the night deepened, Violet found herself standing in the garden, the cool air calming her nerves. She stared up at the sky, the stars obscured by the city lights, and thought about Beth, her mother. She couldn't remember her face, her voice, or her touch, but she felt a connection nonetheless. "I'll do this for you," Violet whispered. "I'll make sure he pays for what he did." With the truth so close, Violet knew they couldn't afford to make mistakes. Clifford was dangerous, but she wasn't afraid. She had spent her whole life fighting to survive, and now she had something worth fighting for. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of the Mitchell estate as Scott and Violet sat in the study, their faces tense with determination. The events of the previous night, including Clifford's veiled threat, had only solidified their resolve. It was time to act. Richard arrived promptly at 9 a.m., carrying yet another stack of files. "I've managed to track down some of the documents Beth mentioned in her diary," he said, spreading them out on the desk. "These tie directly to Clifford's offshore accounts, but we still need more concrete evidence to prove his involvement in the crash." "What about the folder Beth had in the photo?" Scott asked. Richard nodded. "I have a theory. If Clifford didn't destroy it, he likely hid it somewhere secure, somewhere only he could access. My guess is his office at Mitchell Holdings." Scott leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "We'll need a way to get inside without him knowing." Violet, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "What if I do it?" Scott looked at her sharply. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous." "It's the only way," Violet argued. "Clifford already sees me as a threat. If I show up at the office under the guise of wanting to learn about the company, he might let his guard down." Scott hesitated, his protective instincts clashing with the logic of her plan. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. "We'll need to plan this carefully." Over the next few hours, the three of them devised a strategy. Violet would visit Clifford at his office, posing as an eager family member interested in the business. Meanwhile, Richard would monitor the building's security systems, ensuring they had a window of opportunity to search his private files. "This is risky," Scott said as they finalized the plan. "If anything goes wrong—" "It won't," Violet interrupted, her voice firm. "I can handle this." Scott sighed, realizing there was no stopping her. "Be careful," he said, his tone softening. "I can't lose you again." Violet gave him a small smile. "You won't." That afternoon, Violet arrived at Mitchell Holdings, her heart pounding as she stepped into the sleek, modern lobby. She wore a tailored blazer Scott had lent her, hoping it would make her look the part. The receptionist greeted her warmly, clearly aware of who she was. "Miss Mitchell, Mr. Clifford Mitchell is expecting you," she said, gesturing toward the elevator. Violet's stomach churned as she rode up to the top floor, her fingers fidgeting with the ring on her hand. When the elevator doors opened, Clifford was already waiting, his polished smile firmly in place. "Isabella," he said smoothly, extending a hand. "What a pleasant surprise." "Clifford," Violet replied, shaking his hand. "I thought it was time I learned more about the family business." "Of course," Clifford said, his smile never wavering. "Come, let me show you around." As Clifford gave her a tour of the office, Violet feigned polite interest, nodding and asking occasional questions. She noted the way his gaze lingered on her, as if assessing her every move. She kept her demeanor calm, even as her nerves buzzed beneath the surface. Eventually, they reached his private office, a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Clifford gestured for her to sit while he poured them both a drink. "To family," he said, handing her a glass. "To family," Violet echoed, forcing a smile as they talked. Violet subtly scanned the room, looking for anything that might hint at where he had hidden the folder. Her eyes landed on a locked cabinet behind his desk, and she made a mental note. "Tell me," Clifford said, leaning back in his chair. "What made you decide to take an interest in the company now?" Violet shrugged, playing her part. "I just thought it was time. If I'm part of this family, I should understand what we do, right?" Clifford's smile tightened. "Of course. It's always good to take an interest in one's legacy." Before he could press further, Violet glanced at her watch and feigned surprise. "Oh, I didn't realize how late it was. I have another appointment to get to." Clifford stood, his expression unreadable. "We'll continue this another time. Let me walk you out." As they left the office, Violet made a point of looking relaxed, but inside, her heart raced. She had seen enough to know they were on the right track that evening. Back at the estate, Violet recounted everything to Scott and Richard. "He has a locked cabinet in his office," she said. "I'm almost certain the folder is in there." Richard nodded. "We can use that. I'll pull the building's security schedules and figure out the best time to get in." Scott looked at Violet, pride and concern warring in his eyes. "You did well," he said. "But from here on out, I want to handle the rest." Violet shook her head. "No, I'm in this with you. We're finishing this together." Scott sighed, knowing he wouldn't win the argument. "All right," he said, "but we need to be smart about this." Meanwhile, Clifford sat in his dimly lit office, swirling a glass of scotch as he replayed his conversation with Violet in his mind. Her sudden interest in the company didn't sit right with him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was up to something. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Double the security on my office," he ordered, "and make sure the cleaning crew doesn't touch the cabinet. I want everything exactly as it is." Hanging up, Clifford leaned back in his chair, a smirk forming on his lips. "Nice try, Isabella," he murmured, "but I'm always one step ahead." Back at the estate, Scott and Violet sat together in the study, the weight of their plan pressing down on them. "This is it," Scott said. "We're going to bring him down." Violet nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. "For Mom," she said softly, "and for everything he took from us." Scott placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression resolute. "We'll get justice, no matter what it takes." The plan was set. Violet and Scott sat in the study, finalizing the details with Richard, whose meticulous preparation left little room for error. Every possible scenario had been discussed, and every contingency was accounted for. Yet the tension in the room was palpable. "The cleaning crew leaves at 9 p.m., Richard explained, pointing to the building's blueprint spread across the desk. "That gives us a 2-hour window before the next security sweep. I'll monitor the cameras and disable the alarm on Clifford's office remotely. Once you're inside, you'll need to move fast." Scott nodded, his expression grim. "And the lock on the cabinet." "It's biometric," Richard replied. "Clifford's fingerprints are the only way to open it, but I've prepared a device that can bypass it. If you place it on the scanner, it'll mimic his print." Violet studied the blueprint, her resolve solidifying. "And if Clifford finds out we're there, then we get out immediately," Scott said firmly. "No risks, no heroics." Violet smirked faintly. "No promises." At exactly 9:15 p.m., Violet and Scott arrived at Mitchell Holdings. The sleek building loomed over them, its glass facade reflecting the city lights. Violet adjusted the baseball cap she wore, her heart pounding as they entered through the side door Richard had unlocked remotely. The hallways were eerily quiet, the usual buzz of employees replaced by an unsettling stillness. Richard's voice crackled through their earpieces. "Cameras are down. You're clear to proceed to the elevator." Scott led the way, his steps purposeful but cautious. Violet followed close behind, her fingers brushing against the small bag slung over her shoulder, which carried the tools they needed. The elevator ride to the top floor felt agonizingly slow, the tension thick between them. When the doors opened, they stepped into Clifford's private office floor. Richard's voice came through again. "All clear. The cabinet is directly behind the desk." Scott gestured for Violet to move quickly. She nodded and approached the cabinet, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Pulling out the bypass device, she placed it over the biometric scanner. The device blinked red, then green. "It worked," she whispered, pulling the cabinet open. Inside, folders and documents were stacked neatly, their contents organized in Clifford's meticulous fashion. Violet's eyes scanned the labels until one caught her attention. Mitchell Holdings Offshore Accounts. She grabbed it, along with another folder labeled Crash Investigation, 2002. "I've got them," Violet said, turning to Scott. "Good, let's get out of here," Scott replied, already moving toward the door. But before they could leave, Richard's voice rang through their earpieces. Tense and urgent. "You've got company. Clifford just arrived." The sound of the elevator dinging echoed through the hallway. Scott and Violet froze, their eyes locking as they realized the gravity of the situation. "Hide," Scott whispered, pulling Violet behind a large bookshelf. Clifford's voice carried into the office moments later. "I don't care what time it is," he barked into his phone. "Just make sure those contracts are signed by tomorrow." He strode into the office, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Violet held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She clutched the folders tightly, willing herself to stay still. Clifford approached his desk, setting his phone down. His gaze shifted to the open cabinet, and his expression darkened. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping closer to inspect it. Scott motioned for Violet to move toward the door, while Clifford's back was turned. They crept silently, each step agonizingly slow. But just as they reached the threshold, Clifford turned, his eyes narrowing. "Scott," he said, his voice icy. "What are you doing here?" Scott straightened, stepping in front of Violet to shield her. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied evenly. Clifford's gaze flicked to Violet, then to the folders in her hands. Realization dawned on his face, and his expression twisted with anger. "You're stealing from me. We're uncovering the truth," Scott shot back. "Something you've been hiding for years." Clifford laughed coldly. "You have no idea what you're getting into. Put those files back and walk away, or I'll make sure you both regret it." Violet stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "You're the one who should regret it. You killed my mother. You stole 20 years of my life." Clifford's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "You have no proof." "Not yet," Scott said. "But we will. And when we do, you'll answer for everything." Clifford's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Scott. Don't forget who you're dealing with." Scott stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "No, Clifford. You've underestimated who you're dealing with." Before Clifford could respond, Richard's voice came through their earpieces. "Security's on their way. You need to move now." Scott grabbed Violet's arm, pulling her toward the elevator. Clifford didn't stop them, but his cold gaze followed them as they disappeared down the hallway. Once they were safely outside, Violet let out a shaky breath, clutching the folders to her chest. "That was too close," she muttered. Scott placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did great. Now we have what we need to bring him down." Violet nodded, her resolve strengthening. Clifford might have the upper hand now, but they were one step closer to exposing the truth, and she wasn't about to back down. Meanwhile, Clifford stood in his office, his jaw clenched as he replayed the encounter in his mind. Picking up his phone, he made another call. "It's time to accelerate the plan," he said. "No more waiting." Hanging up, he turned to the window, his reflection dark and foreboding. "Let's see how far you're willing to go, Scott." The drive back to the Mitchell estate was silent, the tension between Scott and Violet heavy in the air. Violet clutched the folders in her lap, her mind racing with the confrontation they had just escaped. She glanced at Scott, whose grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white with tension. "We have what we need," Violet said softly, breaking the silence. "Don't we?" Scott glanced at her, his expression hard to read. "We're close," he said, "but Clifford's not going to sit back and let this happen. He'll fight us every step of the way." As they pulled into the driveway, Richard was already waiting in the study, his laptop open and ready. Violet handed him the folders, and he immediately began scanning through the documents. "This is it," Richard said after a few moments. "These records confirm everything. Offshore accounts, embezzlement, and payments to the private investigator around the time of Beth's death. Clifford was siphoning money from the company to fund his own interests, and when Beth found out, he orchestrated the crash to silence her." Violet felt a chill run down her spine. Hearing it laid out so plainly made the truth even harder to bear. "He killed her," she said, her voice trembling. "All for money and power." Scott placed a hand on her shoulder. "And now we make sure he pays for it." The next step was clear. They needed to involve the authorities, but Scott knew Clifford's influence ran deep, and finding trustworthy allies in the legal system would be a challenge. Richard had already begun reaching out to contacts who might help, but the process was slow and fraught with risk. "We need to act fast," Richard said, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "If Clifford gets wind of this, he'll destroy any remaining evidence and cover his tracks." Scott nodded. "What about the private investigator? The one Clifford hired after the crash?" "I've tracked him down," Richard replied. "His name is Marcus Hall. He's retired now, living in a small town upstate. If we can get him to talk, it could seal the case against Clifford." "I'll go," Violet said immediately. "No," Scott said firmly. "It's too dangerous." "Dangerous or not, I need to do this," Violet insisted. "This isn't just about you." "Scott, this is about my mother." Scott hesitated, but the fire in Violet's eyes convinced him. "All right," he said reluctantly, "but I'm coming with you." The following morning, Violet and Scott drove upstate to Marcus Hall's residence, a modest, weathered house at the edge of a quiet town. The neighborhood was unassuming, the kind of place where people kept to themselves. They knocked on the door, and after a moment, a man in his late 60s answered. His face was lined with age, but his sharp eyes suggested a mind still as sharp as ever. "Marcus Hall?" Scott asked. The man nodded warily. "Who's asking?" "My name is Scott Mitchell. This is my daughter, Violet. We need to talk to you about Clifford Mitchell." At the mention of Clifford's name, Marcus's expression darkened. "I don't do that kind of work anymore," he said, starting to close the door. "Please," Violet said, stepping forward. "This is about my mother, Beth Mitchell. She died because of what Clifford did. We need your help." Marcus paused, his hand on the door. He studied Violet for a long moment, then sighed and stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, Marcus poured himself a cup of coffee and gestured for them to sit. "I've been waiting for this day," he said, his tone bitter. "I knew it would catch up to him eventually." Scott leaned forward. "So you know what he did?" Marcus nodded, his hands tightening around his coffee mug. "Clifford hired me to stage an accident. He said it was to scare someone into backing off, but I didn't ask questions. I was paid to follow orders." "What kind of accident?" Violet asked, her voice tight. Marcus hesitated, guilt flashing across his face. "I tampered with the brakes on Beth's car. I thought it was just to make her reconsider whatever she was doing, but then I heard about the crash, and I realized it wasn't just a scare tactic." Scott's fists clenched, his anger barely contained. "And you didn't come forward?" Marcus shook his head. "I was afraid. Clifford's a powerful man, and I knew he'd come after me if I talked. But I've regretted it every day since." "We need your testimony," Violet said. "If you come forward, you can help us bring him to justice." Marcus looked at her, his expression conflicted. "Do you know what you're asking? Clifford won't just let this go. He'll come after all of us." "We're ready for that," Scott said firmly. "But we can't do this without you." Marcus sat in silence for a long moment, then finally nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll do it. I should have done it a long time ago." As they drove back to the city, Violet felt a strange mix of relief and dread. They were closer than ever to exposing Clifford, but the stakes were higher than ever. "Do you think this will be enough?" she asked Scott. "It's a start," Scott said. "But Clifford's not going down without a fight." Violet looked out the window, her resolve hardening. "Then we fight." Meanwhile, Clifford sat in his office, his phone pressed to his ear. "They're moving against me," he said, his tone cold. "Get everything ready. If they think they can win, they're in for a surprise." He hung up, his gaze hardening as he stared out the window. The game was far from over, and Clifford Mitchell wasn't about to lose. The tension in the Mitchell estate was palpable as Scott, Violet, and Richard prepared for their final move. With Marcus Hall agreeing to testify and the incriminating documents in hand, they had everything they needed to confront Clifford once and for all. But the risks had never been higher. Clifford's power and influence loomed over them like a dark cloud, and they knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. "Marcus is meeting with the prosecutor tomorrow morning," Richard said, his eyes scanning the latest updates on his laptop. "Once his testimony is on record, there's no turning back. Clifford will know we're coming for him." Scott nodded, his expression resolute. "Good. Let him know. He's had 20 years of power over this family. It's time we take it back." Violet, sitting nearby, glanced at the stack of documents they had recovered. The truth was all there, laid bare in cold, hard facts. Yet, the weight of what they were about to do felt crushing. She wasn't just fighting for justice. She was fighting for her mother, for the years that had been stolen from her. "Are we ready for this?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. Scott turned to her, his gaze steady. "Yes," he said. "We are." The next morning, Violet accompanied Scott to the courthouse where Marcus Hall was scheduled to meet with the prosecutor. The building was bustling with activity, a stark contrast to the quiet intensity of their mission. Marcus arrived shortly after them, his face pale but determined. "Are you sure about this?" Scott asked, placing a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I am," Marcus replied. "It's time I did the right thing." The meeting with the prosecutor went smoothly. Marcus's testimony, combined with the documents and financial records Richard had uncovered, painted a damning picture of Clifford's actions. The prosecutor assured them that they had enough to file charges. As they left the courthouse, Violet felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, justice felt within reach. But Clifford wasn't going to wait idly for his downfall. Back at his office, he paced the room like a caged animal, his mind racing. He had received word of Marcus's testimony and knew his empire was crumbling. Yet, Clifford Mitchell wasn't a man who accepted defeat. Picking up his phone, he made a call. "I need everything erased. Documents, records, anything that ties me to those accounts," he barked, "and find out what Scott and his daughter are planning." That evening, Scott and Violet returned to the estate, exhaustion evident on their faces. Richard met them in the study, his expression grave. "I've been monitoring Clifford's activity," he said. "He's trying to destroy evidence and leverage his connections to shut this down. We need to act fast." "How fast?" Scott asked. "Tonight," Richard replied. "The prosecutor's office is moving on this tomorrow. But if Clifford gets ahead of us, he could disappear before they have a chance to arrest him." Scott's jaw tightened. "Then we finish this now." As the clock struck midnight, Scott and Violet arrived at Clifford's private residence. The plan was simple but risky. Confront him directly with the evidence they had gathered and ensure he couldn't escape before the authorities arrived. Richard, monitoring the situation from the car, kept a close eye on the security feeds. Clifford was waiting for them in his grand living room, a glass of scotch in hand. His demeanor was calm, but his eyes betrayed his anger. Well, he drawled, setting the glass down. "If it isn't the prodigal brother and his newfound daughter, to what do I owe this? Pleasure?" "We know everything, Clifford," Scott said, his voice steady. "The embezzlement, the offshore accounts, the crash. You can't hide anymore." Clifford smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You think you've won? You have no idea who you're dealing with." "No, you don't," Violet said, stepping forward. "You took everything from us, my mother, my life." "And for what? Money? Power?" Clifford's smirk faltered for the first time. "You don't understand the world we live in, girl. Sacrifices have to be made." "Sacrifices," Scott snapped, his anger boiling over. "You murdered Beth. You left Isabella to grow up alone. And for what? To line your pockets." Before Clifford could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. His composure shattered as he realized what was happening. "You called them," he said, his voice laced with venom. Scott nodded. "It's over, Clifford." The front door burst open, and law enforcement officers poured in, their guns drawn. Clifford's face twisted with rage as they placed him in handcuffs, reading him his rights. "You'll regret this, Scott," Clifford spat as he was led away. "This isn't over." Scott watched in silence as his brother was taken into custody, the weight of years of betrayal and pain finally lifting. He turned to Violet, who stood beside him, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "It's over," she said softly. Scott nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Thanks to you." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Clifford was formally charged with embezzlement, conspiracy, and the murder of Beth Mitchell. His arrest made headlines, and the Mitchell family's name, once tainted by scandal, began to rebuild its legacy. Violet, for the first time in her life, felt a sense of peace. The journey had been long and painful, but she had found more than just justice. She had found her family. One evening, as the sun set over the estate, Violet and Scott sat in the garden, the weight of their journey finally easing. "Mom would be proud," Violet said, her voice tinged with emotion. Scott smiled, his eyes glistening. "She would be proud of you. You're everything she hoped you'd be." Violet leaned back, letting the warmth of the moment wash over her. The past was no longer a shadow. It was a story of strength, resilience, and a family brought back together.